Today we'll be hearing from Madeleine Albright, the first ever female United States Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001 under President Bill Clinton. She spoke recently at the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System annual conference. So if you're keen to hear what she thinks about the current state of democracy in the West, as well as global international relations, keep listening. It goes without saying that 2020 has been an extraordinary year, filled with unprecedented challenges. Not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but ongoing threats to rule of law and democracy, substantial international differences in tackling climate change, worsening trade relationships, and the looming economic fallout from the pandemic. However, Madeleine Albright sees some glimmers of hope.
Despite the pandemic, huge numbers of people voted, and that is something that we should say the resiliency of democracy.
But she admits that the Trump era has been hard on democracy and has fueled growing populism in the United States. As far back as his inaugural speech in 2017, President Donald Trump was already touting his America First rhetoric.
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Many in Europe are hopeful that a Biden administration will repair some of the damage done to the EU-US transatlantic relationship in recent years. Although the EU-US trade in goods and services was valued at more than $1 trillion in 2019, that didn't stop a tit-for-tat tariff war from escalating. In January this year, former Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan travelled to Washington in an effort to repair relations.
The meetings that I've had are in the main very positive and productive, and they confirm that there are powerful and influential voices on both sides of the Atlantic calling for political leadership to refresh, to recalibrate and generally reclaim the shared agenda on trade. And if we go about this in the right way, working together, the mutual benefits can be very significant. But if we fail to do so, the damage will be significant also.
Despite that warning, trade relationships between the two blocs have not been comfortable. From the European side, it would be all too easy to place all the blame on President Donald Trump. But Albright sounds a note of caution.
It is very hard for most Americans to understand how Europe is operating. The European Union is incredibly complicated in terms of how the various parts operate together, how you take things up. And then, frankly, what is difficult is that there was a time that it seemed as if the countries within the European Union were more on the same wavelength. And yet now there is also more nationalism within the European Union. And I think it makes it harder even to understand.
Some of those issues where Albright sees scope for the transatlantic cooperation is on climate change. She said that President-elect Biden was committed to rejoining the Paris Agreement, on fighting the pandemic, and even on UN reform.
We have issues that can only be solved by our partnership, whether it has to do with climate change. I think we also have common vision in terms of trying to deal with the pandemic, which knows no borders, and how we can work together on that. I think actually we have common vision in looking at some organizations. I happen to think that we all think that the UN needs a little fixing.
But she is more positive about the role of NATO in the world in defending democracy.
NATO is not just a military alliance, it's an alliance of democracies, and we need to cherish and realize that democracy has been weakened in some of the countries in the European Union.
She shares this view with Biden, who in 2017 told the World Economic Forum in Davos that NATO was crucial.
And the single greatest bulwark for our transatlantic partnership is the unshakable commitment of the United States to all of our NATO allies. It is a sacred obligation we have embraced that an attack on one is an attack on all. That can never be placed in question.
But of course the EU is struggling with some of its own internal issues, and on Brexit, Albright was particularly downbeat.
Many of us thought it was a mistake, and I think it is unfortunate, but I do think that we need to develop ways that other members of the European Union and the Atlantic relationship can really deal with us honestly, that we really understand what is going on, and that the UK is not our only kind of translator of what is going on.
So, despite the differences between the EU and the US, there is a lot of common ground, and they remain close allies, something that is of enormous importance when viewed against the backdrop of global international relations. Coming up next, we'll take a look at the situation with regard to China, Russia and Turkey. If democracy is under threat in the EU and the US, it has all but vanished from China. The relationship between the economic superpower and the West is at a fragile point, with tensions over Hong Kong and the country's dominance on the world stage. China is hungry for leadership and is taking a more prominent place in the world.
We clearly have a complex relationship with the Chinese, and when the United States is absent, the Chinese fill the vacuum.
In recent years, a trade war has opened up between the US and China, particularly regarding the use of Chinese company Huawei's technology. Albright says this remains a cause for concern and that many Americans are also worried about China taking their jobs. Of course, there are other considerations, in particular China's abuse of human rights, which Albright was keen to highlight.
I think that is something that has not been really put forward enough by the Trump administration, and I do think that it is something that a Biden-Harris administration will, in fact, pay attention to. There's no question about that.
But it's not just China.
The Russians, I am very worried about. They are a country, they're run by a KGB agent. They are playing a weak hand very well, and they are in many ways trying to separate us from you.
However, Albright sees missteps made by the European Union as well, particularly closer to home.
Turkey is the most maddening issue. The EU should have been more welcoming to the Turks at a time that they were looking at how to be more a part of the West, and that the goalposts kept changing for what they had to accomplish. And I said to my EU friends, you should be doing something about this, and I was told to mind my own business.
But international statecraft is Madeleine Albright's business, and fortunately, she sounds cautiously optimistic about the future democracy and trade relations, if all the important lessons of recent years are learned and we work together. This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.